Hello, can you hear me?
Merhaba.
Merhaba. Let me wait for a minute or two, and then let's see if anyone else shows up. Okay, I guess I've given some time for people to show up. There's still only like 20% of the class is here, which is sort of not great. I guess the weather's nice. Okay, so today we're going to carry on with Niçe, and there are a bunch of things I want to talk about. I mean, the book's a bit of a mess. Like if I'd been sent this as a sort of reviewer, I would have said, well, there's some really interesting ideas in it, but it's a bit organized. And why don't you move this bit over here and this bit over there? And, you know, so I think with reading Niçe quite often, I mean, it's good for you guys to read it through in sequence. Yeah, because I think that he's got things in a certain order and he kind of develops themes, he comes back to them. I think for Niçe, you know, he wants to be both a philosopher and a poet. And it's supposed to be both a kind of philosophical work and a literary work. And so, you know, and his favorite type of aesthetic was music. So you might think that we get a lot of sort of variations on a theme. So I'm going to be jumping around sort of thematically. And there's a number of themes I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to start off, I'm just going to tell you what I'm talking about, so you've got an overview of the things that I was going to focus on. So I wanted to start off by finishing off the sort of positive things he says about the priest and the aesthetic ideal and the slave revolt in morality. Because it's very easy to read Niçe as a sort of incel who just thinks, oh, you've got these alpha males, you've got the chads, and that's, you know, we should all try and be chaps. But I think it's really important that he thinks that there are some ways in which he values the ascetic priests. The slave revolt, he paints in very negative terms, but there's also a positive side to the slave revolt. So I'm going to start off talking a bit about that. I then want to come back, and I'm going to, last class we talked about number 1.6 and number 2, section 16, where he says sort of positive things about the priests. And I want to come to 3.13, which is a positive thing about the priests. And I also want to look at 1.16. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. Then I want to talk about suffering and Nietzsche's relationship to Schopenhauer and the problem of suffering. So I'm going to say a little bit about Schopenhauer. Then I'm going to look a little bit at 2.7, essay 2, which really is about the problem of suffering. And then in the final essay, there's an important passage in 3.20 where we have the idea of punishment as the sort of interpretation of suffering, as guilt is the interpretation of suffering as punishment. And I think this little remark in 3.20 is really the kind of the central claim about guilt and bad conscience. This is the kind of punchline of the whole argument about what is bad conscience. But it's in a kind of tiny hidden away section in 3.20 that isn't even in the section about punishment and about guilt. And then the final section, 3.28, you have this long discussion of what's bad isn't suffering but meaningless suffering. And I think this sort of offers his response to Schopenhauer. And then yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of affirming another world and the way in which he's against a sort of certain type of Platonic transcendent attempt, an attempt to give meaning to existence in some sort of transcendent realm. Yeah, so it's Nietzsche, it's for the immanent value of life rather than the transcendent value. And so he thinks that any sort of approach that values something that's beyond life turns out to be something that's life denying. And he thinks that this is his main complaint about aestheticism. And this is why he thinks that the scientific ideal, in some sense, also values something beyond life truth. Yeah, and in some sense, there's a sort of trade-off between truth and life. Sometimes the lie, the myth, is what makes life, gives life its value. So I want to talk a bit about that. And then I want to come to section 1.13, the lambs and the birds of prey passage, and it's a very important account of the will. And then if once we've got through that, if there's time for some other stuff, let's see, there's some other stuff today I could talk about. So that's my plan. I do have a plan. It may not seem like it. Sometimes it looks like I'm just going off in a random detail, but there is a sort of method to my madness somehow and somewhere. Okay, so we talked about these, the idea of the priest being interesting, and we looked at a number of passages about this. That it's only with the priest that we acquire depth. So it's going to take me a little bit. I've got. Sorry, I'm just going to have to. So this is on page 121. Yeah. So he's talking about sickness, and that we've got this idea that this aesthetic ideal is in some sense life denying, but it's also life affirming. It's life against life. Yeah, he says the aesthetic ideal springs from the protective instinct of a degenerating life, which tries by all means to sustain itself and to fight for its existence. Oh, tell me if the connection goes bad. Is my connection okay?
Yes, it is okay.
Is it so bad you can't? Okay, yeah. If it goes bad, just let me know. Yeah. So it's a sort of an expression of sort of decadent life. I think one thing about the aesthetic ideas. Remember we were looking at what he had to say about punishment in oops, sorry. Yeah, in 212, 213, especially in 213, where he talks about the difference between the origin of something and its meaning, and how something emerged doesn't necessarily determine its sort of present value. Yeah, and anything with a history has multiple meanings. So I think one thing is that what he's offering us a certain account of the origin of these things, but we might think that once we've got these ideals, that they can be reappropriated and used for many other different means. Yeah, so the aesthetic ideal springs from, which had its origins in, the protective instincts of a degenerating life. So it has its source in a sort of decadence. And Niçe is one of the great analysts of sort of 19th century decadence, of a sort of society. It's got a bit of like the idea that the 19th century is a bit like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Europe is a sort of culture that has been very kind of alive, and then it's got to this stage, Niçe thinks, where it's got to the end of its sort of productivity, maybe. This is a sort of worry we also find in Mill, when Mill's worried about the kind of uniformity of the modern world, how it's not going to leave room for individuality and genius, that it's a morality, it's a culture of uniformity and public opinion, what Niçe would call about the herd. But this ideal, this ideal arises through the sort of self. So he says, whenever the civilization and taming of man has been carried through, yeah, so we're self-domesticated animals that live in complex cultures and societies where, in order to live at peace with each other, we can't just act on all of our desires. We have to kind of restrain our animal desires in order to live together in a kind of modern urban environment. And this leads to a certain type of sickliness. Yeah. And he thinks that these sort of aesthetic ideals are the expression of this sort of sickness that comes about for us as animals that aren't allowed to express our natural instincts. So the aesthetic ideal is a sort of natural expression of repression. Yeah, and these repressed desires are sort of, in Freudian terms, they're sort of sublimated and turned into creative use. Yeah, so art, and I think Niçe's got this idea that a lot of these desires are going to be sexual desires, aggressive desires. Yeah, so we've got desires to fight and to have sex whenever we want, and these are desires that are sort of tamed, that are sort of controlled, and they don't go away, but they sort of express themselves in creative form. Yeah, and the aesthetic priest is these sort of value systems are expressions, Niçe thinks, of repressed desires, and in particular these repressed desires that the civilized world, civilized life, life together doesn't approve of. So aggressive desires, anger, sexual desire, these are things that we have to control, and they kind of release themselves in art and in the creation of values. And we might think his view of this is entirely negative, but he says the aesthetic priest, this apparent enemy of life, so this is another one of these passages, this apparent enemy of life, this denier, precisely he is amongst the greatest conserving and yes creating forces of life. So the aesthetic priest is one of the greatest kind of conserving and yes creating forces of life. Yeah, where does it come from, this sickliness? he is the sick animal. So man is the sick animal. And I think this is an account of what man is in the civilized state. We're the animal that isn't able to live. We're the sort of caged animal. You go to a zoo and you see a lion in a zoo, and the lion in the zoo is not happy being caged. We're like lions in a zoo. This is to be a sick. And the ascetic priest expresses this sort of sickness. Yep. And the ascetic priest, these sort of creators of aesthetic values, are sort of heroes of value creation. So this, look what Niçe says here. These are terms that are very Nietzschean, the sort of things Nietzsche's life. Certainly he has also dared more, done more new things, braved more, and challenged fate more than all other animals put together. He, the great experimenter with himself. So human beings were not allowed to pick on other things, so we experiment with ourselves. Discontented and insatiable. Yeah, wrestling with animals, nature, and gods for ultimate domination. He, still unvanquished, eternally directed towards the future, whose own restless energies never leave him in peace, so that his future digs like a spur into the flesh of every present. Yeah. How should such a courageous and richly endowed animal not also be the most imperiled, the most chronically and profoundly sick of all sick animals? Yeah, man has often had enough. There are often epidemics of having had enough, mass epidemics of sort of self-flagellation in the Christian tradition. But even this nausea, this weariness, this disgust with himself, all of this bursts from him with such violence that it at once becomes a new fetter. Yep. The no, he says, to life brings it to light, as if by magic, an abundance of tender yeses. So the no, he says, to life, this sort of life-denying force, as it were, brings to light an abundance of tender yeses. Even when he wounds himself, this master of destruction, of self-destruction, the very wound itself afterwards compels him to live. Yeah, so we sort of gnaw on ourselves, we torture ourselves, we wound ourselves, and the sort of wound we find in ourselves, the Nietzsche things, the wound we have as sort of tamed animals, compels us to live. It's a wound that is a life-affirming wound. Yep, a wound that kind of, in some sense, can be used to give meaning to existence. I once had a Russian friend, and she was always kind of miserable and very beautiful, but miserable. And it was like, why are you so miserable all the time? And it's like, oh, but God can only see you when you suffer. You know, like this is the sort of, you know, your suffering is like a flame that God can see. Yeah, think about Dostoevsky. Think about the kind of Dostoevsky type of hero. At the heart of their being, they've got a wound, but it's this wound they have that gives them their self-illumination. It's the kind of wound, the psychic wound inside that makes them fascinating, that makes them great characters, that makes them attractive in a certain way. Yeah. Now, so I think his attitude towards this sort of slave revolt and towards the aesthetic priest is very two-sided. Yeah, it's not one-dimensional. And I think one thing that often is overlooked is on page 52. This is number 116. Let me try and get back. 52. Oh, Adijan. Oh, the little wound in the other room. Can you hear him? So he says we got these two opposing values, good and bad, and good and evil. We've got the kind of the slave values, we've got the kind of noble values. We've got the kind of noble, stupid, life-affirming, unthinking. Yeah, the sort of without conscience, sort of Boris Johnson, just, you know, just some monster. And then you've got the kind of slave morality, interesting, self-torturing. Yeah, and they've engaged in a fearful struggle on Earth for thousands of years. And though the latter value has certainly been on top for a long time, there are still places where the struggle is yet undecided. One might even say that it has risen even higher, and that's become more and more profound and spiritual. So this kind of struggle between these different sets of values. So that today there is perhaps no more decisive mark of a higher nature, of a more spiritual nature, than of being divided in this sense. Yeah, and being a genuine battleground of these opposed values. So, I mean, I think Nietzsche, you know, Nietzsche's a bit mad, it's a bit syphilitic, that he sees himself as the sort of redeemer in a certain way. And I think Nietzsche, I think this is sort of Nietzsche himself. Nietzsche sees himself as a sort of battlefield, that the soul is a battlefield. And this is something I think Nietzsche thinks that should be embraced, rather than thinking, well, which values do I endorse? Yeah, in some sense, the real strength is to contain multitudes within oneself. So my sort of reading of Nietzsche, and remember his perspectivism or perspectivalism, that knowing involves seeing the world from many different perspectives. Now, and you might think, well, but one of these sets of values has to be right. And you might think, no, both of these, all these different sets of valuation reveal different things about what's valuable in life. Yeah. And then you might think, well, surely we need a higher perspective of kind of that can encompass them, that we can use to judge between them. And I think Nietzsche's idea is no. So like in the war, in the battle of the soul of the higher nature, there is no international law. Yeah, it's a kind of war. Yep. And what you can find is a sort of I guess what you can find are sort of dynamic stabilities, where you have a sort of war where each side has its territory. There are skirmishes, there are battles, but no side is strong enough to completely to win. So I take it that yeah, and so the symbol of this struggle, inscribed in letters legible across all human history, is Rome against Judea. This is Judea against Rome. So this is the kind of the Christian versus the non-Christian, or the monotheistic versus the non-monotheistic. Later on, we get this sort of struggle between Plato and Homer. We might think that Plato against Homer is a bit like Rome versus Judea. Yeah, Plato, in some sense, is the founder of the you might think of the Christian philosophical kind of, yeah. You get Socrates sometimes in what is in The Birth of Tragedy. You have Socrates against the tragedians. You have philosophy against tragedy, and in The Birth of Tragedy you get the kind of the duality between Dionysus and Apollo. Yeah, with Dionysus being the god of drinking, of ecstasy, of crazy wild orgies, and Apollo being the god of sort of order and harmony and individuation. The Dionysian moment is sort of getting lost in being, where all boundaries are broken down. The Apollonian sort of thing is, well, and when Nietzsche first started working on The Birth of Tragedy, it looked like he was going to try to be affirming Dionysus against Apollo. But by the end of The Birth of Tragedy, you get the idea that tragedy, in some sense, presents both Apollo and Dionysus at the same time. Yeah, that the chorus is like Dionysian, but the individual stories, because it individuates and the individual actor is Apollinaриan. Yeah, and you know, The Birth of Tragedy is was inspired by Wagner, so a Wagnerian opera. that Nietzsche thought the music was Dionysian, that Nietzsche was very kind of wussy when it came to music. You know, he'd go there and kind of swoon. He's the sort of guy who'll go to a concert and be like, oh, yeah, and oh, the music is too much. I'm going to faint because I lost myself in the music. And then it's like he thought that having the drama on the stage gave you a story to concentrate on, that in some sense stopped the music being too overwhelming. So in the opera, you got the Dionysian kind of losing yourself in the music, but then the Apollinarian kind of following the story. Yeah. And so in tragedy and Wagnerian opera, he thought in his earlier works that you have these two very different things combined into one, where you're getting both. And so I take it that Nietzsche, in some sense, the mark of a higher nature is being divided, is being a battleground of these of opposed values. Yeah. So how is it possible to live as a battleground? This is why I think, like this Walt Whitman thing, that I contain multitudes. This is the sort of my understanding of Nietzsche's idea. Now, we've got this idea of we're the kind of tame, self-torturing animal, and we're the animal that suffers. Now, I've got some quotes from Schopenhauer, and I couldn't find, if anyone can find this online, I couldn't find a PDF. So if anyone can find a PDF of this, it's Arthur Schopenhauer's Essays and Aphorisms. It's a little penguin version of his text. And they have, starting on page 41, they have kind of a bunch of stuff that Schopenhauer says about suffering, on the suffering of the world. So kind of, and it's just funny, some of this stuff. So I'm just going to read some of the stuff. If the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. Yeah. I therefore know of no greater absurdity than that absurdity which characterizes almost all metaphysical systems, that of explaining evil as something negative. For evil is precisely that which is positive. Evil is pain. Yeah, that which makes itself palatable. What can be felt is pain, is suffering. And good, on the other hand, i.e., all happiness and gratification, is that which is negative, the mere abolition of a desire and an extinction of a pain. It's a very sort of Platonic view that Schopenhauer has this idea that desire is want is lack. If you want something, you've got something missing, and therefore desire is painful. And satisfying a desire then is moving from a painful state to not having a desire. So satisfying a desire, you go from having a desire which is painful to not being in pain. Sexual desire, sexual pleasure, you go from kind of being tense, oh, that's not nice, oh, to being relaxed. That's sort of Schopenhauer's idea of sexual pleasure. Now, I think the problem with Schopenhauer is that he's just wrong about pleasure. This is one of Aristotle's criticisms of Plato. Aristotle says that pleasure isn't a movement, it's an activity. And that pleasure itself is just the awareness of a bit of your body, or some bodily activity or some mental activity working well. I think Nietzsche's idea, I think Plato, Schopenhauer's idea that you find in Plato, you find in Buddhism, is the idea that, well, that human pleasure is just desire satisfaction. And whenever you have a desire, this is being in a bad state. You're lacking something, there's something wrong. And then pleasure is just the movement from a bad state to a not bad state. Yeah, so the real thing that's positive is pain, and pleasure and the good stuff is just the removal of pain. Yeah. This is also consistent with the fact that as a rule, we find pleasure much less pleasurable and pain much more painful than we expected. Yeah, so pain, pleasure, we expect some pleasure, and then when we get it, it's not very good. We really want something. You're a kid, you really, really want this present, and then you get it, and it's like, oh, yeah. Whereas, pain is really nasty. then this is the quote that I've read before. This is on page 42. A quick test of the assertion that enjoyment outweighs pain in this world, or that they are at any rate balanced, would be to compare the feelings of an animal engaged in eating another with those of the animal being eaten. Yeah, that's sort of Schopenhauer's idea. And so pain is the big question mark on existence. And Schopenhauer thinks that like pain is just is just basic. He also thinks that life is sort of meaningless as well. Yeah. So the life. There's a section on the vanity of existence, and he talks about the continual becoming without being. That's what human beings are, this becoming without being, in continued desire without satisfaction, in the continued frustration of striving of which life consists. So life is a type of striving, and this striving is just unpleasant because we're full of desires, and to be in a state of desire is to not have what we want. And not having what you want is to be frustrated. So life is just this constant state of striving. And then when we get what we want, we just want more, that we get what I want. I mean, if we get everything that we want, we're just bored. Yeah. So life is sort of pretty shitty. This is the idea. And Schopenhauer thinks the only sort of respite, sometimes when we listen to music, we have a kind of brief moment of sort of rest from this activity. And I think Nietzsche's whole philosophy, at least a big portion of it, is aimed at kind of giving a response to Nietzsche. So, sorry, to Schopenhauer. So I think I talked a little bit last time about essay 2, or last week, essay 2, number 7. But I'm not sure exactly. I want to just run through it again. So this is on page, I need to find my marked copy. So this is on page 6, starting on page 67. Oops. Yeah, so he's been saying, so in the previous section he's been talking about the joy of cruelty. Yeah, so he said, what if someone owes you some money and you don't get paid back, but then you get to punish them, what reward are you getting? And he says, well, the reward you're getting is the pleasure of being allowed to vent his power freely on one who is powerless. Yeah, the voluptuous pleasure of doing evil for the pleasure of doing it, the enjoyment of violation. Yeah, this enjoyment will be the greater the lower the creditor. Yeah, in punishing the debtor, the creditor participates in a right of the masters. Yeah, and so he's talked about the kind of pleasure in imposing your will on others. And now this sort of will to dominate, partly it's got to do with, if you're weak, it's imposing your will on other human beings. But I think he thinks that in the artist also wants to dominate nature. You inform nature, you create something, you put your stamp on the world, you kind of take a block of marble and inform it. That's a form of kind of domination. Yeah. Now, and this is a basic part of human activity. And this is, this is very famous. That even though the modern world has lost some of the odor of blood and torture, so even in the modern world, we don't get to really hurt people, but like we have things like German morality. So the categorical imperative smells of cruelty. So in the modern world, instead of kind of beating people up and cutting off their hands, we kind of morally judge them, and we engage in this kind of super moralization. And the pleasure we get from this is the pleasure of making suffer, which is a sort of general festival. And yeah, so this is what he's been talking about, the human instinct, the human drive to make suffer. Yeah, and how can making suffer constitute a compensation? Well, it's this, we're these tame domestic animals, and then kind of these sort of punishment, these sort of displays are these sort of festivals. Yeah, so we have in the olden times we had these great festival pleasures of more primitive man, and I take it the idea that this in the modern world, this desire to make suffer, Nietzsche thinks turns inwards. Yeah, so we live in these societies where, in order to live together in these societies, we're not allowed to go around and just randomly hit people unless we're Will Smith or I don't know, yeah. But instead of that, we sort of torture ourselves. We turn this inwards. Now, this is the background, and I think that. So this is the section I wanted to look at. So he says, with this idea, by the way, I by no means concerned to furnish our pessimists with more grist for their discord. Furnish our pessimists with more grist for their discordant and creaky meals of life satiety. So, and by the pessimists, he's talking about the Schopenhauerians and those influenced by Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer had this philosophy of pessimism, a philosophy of saying no to life, of rejecting will. And Nietzsche kind of wants to oppose his sort of philosophy of a yes-saying philosophy to this Schopenhauerian pessimism. So this section is sort of directed at Schopenhauer. And he says, let me declare expressly that in the days where mankind was not yet ashamed of its cruelty, life on earth was more cheerful than it is now that pessimists exist. So kind of the world used to be a lot more violent, and it was also a lot more cheerful. Yeah, I don't think of a Monty Python film, where some guy just gets his arms chopped off, but it's, this is the Middle Ages. Yeah, the criminal being tortured to death, in some sense, Nietzsche thinks that people just dealt with it. And this idea that pain is a sort of question mark on existence is something that has come about through the emergence of this new sort of morality. Baby, could you be a bit quieter? Baby, could you be a bit quieter? Zubedi is just shouting on the telephone. Can you hear me again? Yeah. So today, he says, when suffering is always brought forward as the principal argument against existence, as the worst question mark, one does well to recall the ages in which the opposite opinion prevailed, because men were unwilling to refrain from making suffer and saw in it an enhancement of the first order, a genuine seduction to life. Now, perhaps in those days, the delicate may be comforted by this thought. Pain did not hurt as much as it does now. It says something about Negroes, which probably today is not appropriate, so I won't read that. But I think one thing he thinks is that the sort of susceptibility to pain is a cultural thing. There's a cultural attitude. Nietzsche thinks there's a cultural aspect to the way in which pain is bad. Yeah, that and he thinks that, yeah, and he thinks that the more sort of you got the kind of idle upper class. They're the ones who really feel pain. You know, people who work in factories, you know, just, you know, they get injured and they carry on working. But think about when I lived in America, like think of the kind of rich American teenager. Yeah, you know, they hurt their finger and it's like the end of the world, and they've got to, all their friends have to come and look at it, and it's just like, what should we do? Ooh, yeah. So he thinks the curve of human susceptibility to pain seems in fact to take an extraordinary and almost sudden drop as soon as one has passed the upper 10,000 or 10 million as the top stratum of culture. And for my own part, I have no doubt that the combined suffering of all the animals ever subjected to the knife for scientific ends is utterly negligible compared with one painful night of a single hysterical blue stocking. For those into animal rights, into the sort of Peter Singer type of arguments, that here we've got an interesting argument that well, the pain itself isn't that bad. It's how we interpret the pain, and it's the sort of, and that if you're a neurotic kind of 19th century German aristocratic woman, your pains are going to be much greater than the pains of all the animals in the world. Yeah, you're suffering. Yeah, because you've become more capable of, and you've become more attuned to suffering. So I think Nietzsche thinks, yeah, yeah, so I think Nietzsche thinks that yeah, so pain hurts more today in the modern world. Yeah, and pain itself isn't really that bad. This is going to be Nietzsche's sort of response to Schopenhauer. The pain, yeah, what really arouses indignation against suffering is not suffering as such, but the senselessness of suffering. Yeah. So once we've got it interpreted, the suffering can actually be an enhancement to life rather than a sort of something, it's a negation of life. So think of kind of, you know, if you run a marathon and at the end of it, it really hurts, but you have this real sense of satisfaction because the pain you've got is the sort of, it's the pain of success. That in Christianity, you've got a whole mysterious machinery of salvation into suffering. So for the Christian, this suffering is just part of this huge metaphysical story. Yeah. So and for the naive man of more ancient times, for the Greeks, they understood all suffering in relation to the spectator. So suffering is a sort of spectator sport. It's entertainments for the gods. Yeah. So we're the sort of beings who are these interpreting beings, and suffering itself, pain isn't particularly bad. Now that, and this is, so this idea, so there's two things about pain. First of all that we need to interpret it. Yeah, so yeah. And secondly, that there's a sort of response to Schopenhauer here, because pain itself turns out to be not really a problem. And pain can actually be an enhancement of life rather than something negative to life. Yeah, so why? So Nietzsche's response to pessimism is to say, let's embrace our pains. The truly kind of Nietzschean hero has this amor fati, love of faith. They're able to say yes to their whole life. And saying yes to one's whole life involves saying yes to the pain. You might think the pain is part of your growth. Yeah, you have a breakup. My nephew is 16 and his first girlfriend just left him. And you know, he's a complete wreck, and he's like, yeah, but like you can turn this into, you know, he's a sort of bass player. Then we're both musicians. She's one of the top cellists, young cellists in UK. And it's like, yeah, she can turn the pain of this breakup into, you know, into her music. Yeah. that's one way of dealing with it. In some sense, you can take the pain, this wound inside, and the sort of modern idea is you can nurture it and use the pain as a sort of enhancement for life. Now, Nietzsche thinks that this is what sort of Christianity did, but I think he thinks that the Christian way of dealing with it, it sort of reached its end time. That in 320, I just want to, as we're talking about interpreting pain, that we have his, I think if you're asking a question about Nietzsche on guilt, so this is on page 140, there will be some question on the sort of take home on Nietzsche and guilt. And I take it that it's here that we get the kind of final account of the origin of bad conscience. So I think this is the, so men are kind of suffering animals. Man suffering himself in some way or other, but in any case, physiologically, like an animal shut up in a cage, uncertain why or wherefore, thirsting for reasons, because reasons relieve. So we're sort of suffering because we're living together in society and can't act on our impulses. And this causes us frustration and dissatisfaction. Thirsting too for remedies and narcotics. At last takes counsel with one who knows hidden things too. From the ascetic priest, and behold, he receives a hint. He receives from his sorcerer, the ascetic priest, the first hint as to the cause of his suffering. So why am I so unhappy? Why am I so dissatisfied? What is the cause of my dissatisfaction? And the ascetic priest says, you yourself are the cause. Yeah, that's what guilt is. You're unhappy? Why are you unhappy? It's your fault. You're the cause of your own suffering. You've done something wrong. Yeah. He must seek it in himself in some guilt, in a piece of the past. There's something you did in the past wrong. That's why you're suffering. Yeah, there's some ritual you didn't do properly. You're supposed to burn some meat for the gods, and you did the wrong bit or the wrong amount. He must understand his suffering as punishment. Yeah.
It sounds like a start of
a way of kind of understanding.
When you go to church or talking to someone who says, who wears t-shirts says live, love, that sort of thing. Like when you go to church or other places like that, they always say you should search into your heart or something about the past or karma. That sounds like advice from one of them.
Yeah, and I think Nietzsche thinks that, well, this is one way of going about it. But this leads, this way of doing it leads to the fact that you're always blaming yourself. And it leads to a certain form of sort of self-hatred. Yeah, and so in some sense, you might think if Nietzsche was around today, maybe he'd be writing self-help books. I don't know, it's kind of, stop hating yourself. Yeah. But if you do feel guilty, then you might think, hold on, but no, I've got another reason to feel bad about myself, because I don't think I should hate myself. I don't think I should feel guilty, but I do feel guilty. And I feel bad because I feel guilty. But, you might think that the Nietzschean may just add another layer of kind of guilt. Because now you feel guilty for feeling guilty. Yeah, because you realize that Nietzsche's right and you think, yeah, this is something bad I'm doing. I'm blaming myself for something that isn't my fault. And that's another thing to blame yourself for. Yeah, why do I keep blaming myself? So it's not obvious to me that but yeah, I think that, I don't know if any of you have ever been in therapy, but there are different schools of therapy. And one school of therapy is like cognitive behavioral therapy. I think often when you think about something like depression, I think one sort of view is that depression is anger that's turned inwards. So you've got some anger for something outside, and then in some sense that anger is misdirected, and it becomes anger at yourself. Yeah, and I think because Nietzsche was so influential on Freud, and a lot of Freud's main ideas he took Nietzsche. So I think a lot of things that today we take for granted in therapy are things that have their roots in Nietzsche. These were kind of ideas that people came up with. So this idea that we are these sort of self-blaming, self-torturing animals. But you might think that yeah, so you might think, well, should we stop torturing ourselves? Then you might think, well, is that what Nietzsche's saying? Is it bad to be self-torturing? Is it, with this self-torturing, life again became very interesting, awake, everlastingly awake, sleepless, glowing, charred, spent, and yet not weary. Thus the man, the sinner, initiated into this mystery. The ancient mighty sorcerer in his struggle with displeasure, the aesthetic priest, he had obviously won. His kingdom had come. One no longer protested against pain. One thirsted for pain, more pain, more pain. The desire of his disciples and initiates has cried for centuries. So, I mean, given the fact that pain is sort of a natural part of our existence, then insofar as we want to kind of be affirming our existence, insofar as we want to affirm life, then in some sense we have to affirm pain. And I think that this is the thing that Nietzsche likes about the aesthetic ideal, that they have found a way to say yes to pain. But I think Nietzsche thinks they found a way to say yes to pain that just creates an ever more increasing cycle of pain. So it's a way of saying yes to pain that leads to more and more pain. Okay, I realized that I spent a bit longer on this. There was one other section about pain I wanted to talk to. Why don't I do this now, and then we'll finish a little bit late, because this is the last section about pain and suffering. And this is once again returning its variations on the same theme. And once again, this is the kind of final section of the book. If we think of the book as a symphony, this is like, or as a musical piece, this is like, at the end, you have that, whatever they call it at the end in music, and you going through all the themes. It's not the overture, what's it called? The endature? No, they should have a, yeah. The final credits music, yeah, where you get the, no, okay. So this is sort of summing up where we've been. He says, apart from the aesthetic ideal, man, the human animal, had no meaning so far. So the aesthetic ideal gave meaning to our lives. His existence on earth contained no goal. Why man at all? This was a question without an answer. The will for man on earth was lacking. Behind every great human destiny, there sounded a refrain as yet greater, in vain. Life is meaningless. This is precisely what the aesthetic ideal means, that something was lacking, that man was surrounded by a fearful void. He did not know how to justify, to account for, to affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his meaning. He also suffered otherwise. So he suffers from the problem of his meaning. This is the idea of Schopenhauerian idea of existence is in vain. He also suffered otherwise. He was in the main a sickly animal, because he's a tame, domesticated, caged animal. But his problem was not suffering itself. The problem was the meaning of suffering. Why do I suffer? Man, the bravest of animals and the one most accustomed to suffering, does not repudiate suffering as such. He desires it. He even seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. The meaninglessness of suffering, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far. And the aesthetic ideal offered man meaning. It was the only meaning offered so far. Any meaning is better than none at all. And the aesthetic ideal was in every sense the force d'amour par excellence so far. In it, suffering was interpreted. So these sort of ideal systems of values offer a sort of interpretation. So the question is can we find an interpretation of our suffering? And I think this is where he wants to question the world to truth, because any sort of interpretation of our suffering is going to have to be in terms of a myth. And these sort of interpretations of our own suffering, these self-interpretations, asking kind of, oh, but is it true? And that's one step too far. There are certain things where it doesn't matter if they're true. We can have sort of myths to live by. Yeah, I think one of the most popular books about Nietzsche kind of pushes this, I think, a bit too far, by Alexander Nehamas, who was at Princeton, called Niçe. It's called something like Nietzsche, Life as Literature. Anyone's interested. The tremendous void seemed to have been filled. The door was closed to any kind of suicidal nihilism. So in some sense, I mean, if you have to choose between like Christianity and nihilism, I think Nietzsche's sort of with Christianity, because, you know, this sort of suicidal nihilism. But this interpretation, there is no doubt of it, brought fresh suffering with it. Deeper, more inward, more poisonous, more life-destructive suffering. It placed all suffering under the perspective of guilt. So I think that Nietzsche doesn't like the idea of guilt and punishment and all of this. So I think he wants to offer a way of self-interpretation that offers a way to give meaning to our suffering, but in a way that doesn't interpret it as punishment. Yeah. So can we have this sort of, and I think the way forward he goes is a sort of aesthetic one. Yeah, that we interpret our lives as works of art. Yeah, this idea that my life is a work of art, then this gives, in some sense, some sort of meaning to your suffering. But all of this notwithstanding, that's why I think for Nietzsche, aesthetics is sort of central. Yeah, because I think the aesthetic, and this, I mean, Schopenhauer thought aesthetics was central because he thought music was a solution to suffering. But his sort of idea is that music doesn't interpret the suffering, doesn't make suffering positive. It just makes us forget about our suffering for some time. I think Nietzsche wants a kind of an account of the aesthetic whereby art can in some sense redeem the world. It's very kind of, I think it's a very, very much a sort of early romantic sort of idea. I think you find in people like Hölderlin, yeah, this idea of art redeeming the world. We don't need Jesus for redemption. What we need is art and music. But all of this notwithstanding, man was saved thereby by this sort of aesthetic ideal. He possessed a meaning. He was henceforth no longer like a leaf in the wind, a plaything of nonsense, the senseless. He could now will something. No matter at first to what end, with what he willed, the will itself was saved. But we can no longer conceal from ourselves what is expressed by this. I'm just going to finish reading this and then I'll finish. We can no longer conceal from ourselves what is expressed by all that willing, which has taken its direction from the aesthetic ideal. This hatred of the human. Yeah, so one thing is that the way Christianity has given meaning and monotheistic religions to existence is in a way that involves a hatred of the human and even more of the animal and more still of the material. Yeah. It's a transcendent valuation that values life in terms, that gives value in terms of something that's outside life. This horror of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and beauty, this longing to get away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wishing, from longing itself. Yeah, all of this means let us dare to grasp it, a will to nothingness. So an aversion to life, rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life, but it is and remains a will. And to repeat in conclusion what I said at the beginning, man would rather will nothing than man would rather will nothing than not will. Yeah, in German it sounds a bit better because you got Niçe and Niçe. Yeah, but man would rather will nothing than not will. Yeah, and it's this kind of now Nietzsche I think wants to kind of he thinks Christianity has sort of died, thinks that the atheists has sort of won, but they've still bought into a sort of life-denying set of values. then the question is how can we have a life-affirming set of values? I think ultimately, yeah, it's a kind of, you might think, well, it's a sort of Heraclitan sort of valuation, that we have to value becoming over being. Yeah, that instead of valuing being, we have to say yes to becoming. Anyway, I've gone on for too far. And I got through only one of the things I wanted to get through today, but that's so good. We've still got another hour. So after the break, let's talk a little bit about transcendence. Yeah, okay. No, okay. So let's have a 10-minute break, and then we'll start again. Hello. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, so so one last thing on sort of this theme. So this is 324, and yeah, so one thing I like about Nietzsche is he kind of quotes big chunks of himself. Yeah, so here's an authority. It's me from the gay science. Yeah. So he's been talking about this sort of aesthetic ideal, and then he's been talking about the priests and the kind of obvious self-deniers. He then talks about science, Wissenschaft in German. Of course, in the 19th century, science didn't mean the hard sciences. So philosophy is considered a science. Yeah, any form of systematic knowledge is science. In Britain in the 19th century, you still have the moral sciences. Yeah, so science is not so when you're reading him talking about the man of science or science, yeah, he's got a much broader, like you could think academics in general are going to be under there, people who care about knowledge, and that's going to include philosophers. And so section 24 I think is interesting, and this has got to do with his sort of kind of analysis of transcendence. Yeah, so he's talking about the last idealists amongst the philosophers, the kind of desired opponents of the aesthetic ideal. I mean, I don't know if any of you have, do you know about the kind of new atheists today? People like Dawkins, and is that big in Turkey? Or I think 10 years ago they were quite big. Are they, is that still a thing? No? Yes?
I guess yes.
Yeah. I mean, so I think he's talking about the sort of 19th century atheists, agnostics, ones who are sort of openly rejecting God. And these people are unbelievers. The German word for believe and the German word for faith, you have Glaube, which can either mean belief or faith. So one of the things Nietzsche is talking about, one of the things going on here is when you read belief or unbelievers, that in German it's got much more of this double meaning, where it can mean either those without faith. Now, I take it that his point is that they still have a faith. They have this faith, they've given up religious faith, but they have this faith in truth. They believe in the value of truth and knowledge. And so in some sense, they have got this ideal of truth and knowledge. And so I take it if you value truth, then one of the things that Nietzsche thinks you're going to do is to question the value of truth. And so these sort of unbelievers themselves are skeptical of belief. Yeah, they're skeptical of faith. So faith gives us a reason. The fact that something's based on faith gives us a reason to reject it. And so this is a sort of self-critique, I think, here, this section. He says, we men of knowledge have gradually come to mistrust believers of all kind, those with faith. Our mistrust has gradually brought us to make inferences the reverse of those of former days. Wherever the strength of a faith, the strength of a belief is very prominently displayed. So if someone believes something very strongly, this gives us a reason to mistrust the belief. Yeah. because we think, we care about truth and knowledge. We don't like faith and enthusiasm. We infer a certain weakness of demonstrability, even the improbability of what is believed. We too do not deny that faith makes blessed. That is precisely why we deny that faith proves anything. So if we or belief proves anything, a strong faith, a strong belief that makes blessed raises suspicions against that which is believed. It does not establish truth, it establishes a certain probability of deception. Yeah, so, and in some sense, if this is his project of enlightenment, I take it taken to the extreme, that if you really want to question all beliefs, then you have to question this belief in, so these naysayers and outsiders of today who are unconditional on one point, their insistence on intellectual cleanliness. These hard, severe, abstinent, heroic spirits who constitute the honor of our age, all these pale atheists, antichrists, anti-Christians. One of his last books is called The Antichrist, which is himself. Immoralists, he once called himself an immoralist. Nihilists, these skeptics, etc. Yeah, so these guys, these last idealists of logic, in whom alone the last intellectual conscience dwells. This is all kind of seems to be very positive. However, they still one thing they haven't got beyond. That these free spirits. So I think being a free spirit, Nietzsche likes the idea of free spirits. Now, this aesthetic ideal is precisely their ideal too. They themselves embody it today, and perhaps they alone. They are the most spiritualized product, its most advanced frontline troops and scouts. They are far from being free spirits, for they still have faith in truth. So this is the now so this is his sort of criticism of the sort of atheists, the free spirits of today. He says, it is precisely in their faith in truth that they are more rigid and unconditional than anyone. And Nietzsche says, this is on page 151, I know this from too close up, perhaps. So Nietzsche himself is someone who has valued truth. And this valuation of truth has, in some sense, involved the general renunciation of all interpretation. So that we shouldn't have, we should just get to the truth. We should avoid, I mean, one thing about this word truth is that, remember, he has this idea that all knowing is perspectival. So the idea of, insofar as this idea of truth involves a sort of, a non-interested, a disinterested observation of the universe. I think this is what he's objecting to. This renunciation of interpretation. And this will to truth is faith in the aesthetic ideal itself. Now, these passages have been interpreted in various ways. I buy into the interpretation that is sort of is being made by Maud Marie Clark. And so her book on Nietzsche, I think it's called Nietzsche and on Truth and Philosophy, or Nietzsche on Truth and Interpretation. I think, but she thinks that Nietzsche is quite happy with truth with a small t. The problem he has is with this ideal of truth as non-perspectival. So this attack on the ideal of truth is an attack on the idea of truth with a big T, something like a kind of final finish science, an absolute perspective on the world, and the like. There's a sort of more French sort of interpretation where, oh, he wants to just get rid of any sort of constraints and everything's up for interpretation. Yeah. If you're interested in getting a better view of this, that Maudry Clark goes through these various interpretations in her book. So if you're interested on what Nietzsche's view is and thinking about some of the alternatives, I recommend her book. But yeah, so I think what he's against, he says, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as science without any presuppositions. Yeah, that of a sort of viewpoint that doesn't, of an eye that isn't somewhere. Yeah, all knowing is perspectival knowing. And any sort of perspectival knowing comes with a whole bunch of presuppositions. And if we care about knowledge, we should just come to see that we can look at the world from many different perspectives. Yeah. That doesn't mean we can't say that some things are false. You know, there might be just some claims that are false. And so I think Nietzsche thinks that there are some things that are false. Yeah, but yeah, so he says, strictly speaking, there's no such thing as science without any presuppositions. So I take it the people who have faith in truth, in this ideal of truth, have the idea of a sort of absolute presuppositionless science as a sort of view from nowhere. This thought does not bear thinking it through. It is pathological. A philosophy or a faith, a glaube, a belief, must always be there first of all, so that science can acquire from it a direction, a meaning, a limit, a method, a right to exist. So all knowing is perspectival, all knowing is interested, all knowing is connected to practice, all knowing is knowing from a perspective. Yeah, but that doesn't, the fact that knowledge is perspectival doesn't mean that there's no room for notions of truth or true or false. Yeah, I think this is the idea. So last week I talked about the passages where we get his sort of perspectivalism. So I think that what's going on in this passage, this attack on the questioning the value of truth, I think really what he's against is this ideal of pure objectivity, the ideal of a sort of disinterested, perspectiveless, disinterested, will-less contemplation of reality. It's the idea of pure theory without any practice, the idea of something like contemplation. Yeah, and this is the view he wants to reject. And I think he thinks that the opposing view, these people who kind of believe in truth in a metaphysical sense, basically end up postulating a sort of ideal world opposed to the real, and then end up willing the abstract ideal over the real. And this is his self-quote from The Gay Science. So I'll just read it. He says, "The truthful man, in the audacious and ultimate sense presupposed by the faith in science, yeah, thereby affirms another world than that of life, nature, and history." Yeah, so yeah, you know, think of the physicist, the materialist today, who says what really exists is what we find in mathematical theories. So we've got this abstract model of the world, and that's what there really is. Yeah, and that's where true knowledge lies. And insofar as he affirms this other world, does this not mean that he has to deny its antithesis, this world, our world? It is still a metaphysical faith that underlies our faith in science. And we men of knowledge of today, we godless men and anti-metaphysicians, we too still derive our flame from the fire ignited by a faith millennia old. The Christian faith, which was also Plato's, that God is truth, that truth is divine. But what if this belief is becoming more and more unbelievable? If nothing turns out to be divine any longer, unless the error, blindness lies. If God himself turns out to be our longest lie. So I think that my sort of take here is that yeah, he wants to reject the idea of pure objectivity, And insofar as our drive to truth is driven by this idea of pure objectivity, this is the sort of thing he wants to question. And I think he thinks that in some sense, this is why I take Nietzsche to be a sort of, sees himself as a sort of culmination of the Enlightenment rather than anti-Enlightenment. He thinks that these sort of post-Kantian atheists are still too metaphysical. They still kind of posit some ideal world, the world of pure objectivity that can be known through kind of science, as opposed to the kind of living embodied world we find ourselves in. Yeah, and so yeah, that's my take. So yeah, so the aesthetic ideal has hitherto dominated all philosophy because truth was posited as being, as God, as the highest court of appeal, because truth was not permitted to be a problem at all. Yeah, is this permitted understood? From the moment faith in the God of the aesthetic ideal is denied, a new problem arises, that of the value of truth. The will to truth requires a critique. Yeah, so once again, this is where I think there's a sort of Kantian side to this. We've got this critique of science critiquing itself. So sort of Nietzsche thinks that Kant didn't go far enough in his critique. Let us define our own task. Yeah, the value of truth must for once be experimentally called into question. Now, I think this passage, these final few sections of the genealogy, yeah, I mean, there's lots of different interpretations and ways of reading it. So I've told you what my interpretation is. There are more sort of anti-philosophy takes. I mean, when he says that the will to truth must be called into question experimentally, is he kind of really buying into some sort of radical empiricism? Yeah, that knowledge is kind of piecemeal rather than systematic. I think there's part of that in Nietzsche, that we have to accept the kind of piecemeal nature, the partial nature of human knowing. Yeah. Okay, so I can hear Alijan crying in the other room. So yeah, so this section, well, let me say something about the next section. So this section, we've got philosophy. Is philosophy really the real opponent of the aesthetic ideal? And the answer is no. Philosophy itself, insofar as it values the will to truth, is an expression of this aesthetic ideal. The real opposing ideal isn't the sort of atheistic philosophy, but the real opposing ideal is art. Yeah, and this is the passage I think we talked about last week. Yeah, this is art and the world of deception. It has a good conscience. It is Plato versus Homer. And so I think these sections, yeah, are worth looking at. I also think that if you're a sort of so one thing about Nietzsche is Nietzsche has been quite popular, I think, in the second half of the 20th century amongst people on the left. And I think one thing is if you've got a kind of progressive side, I think there are bits that are very, very problematic in Nietzsche. So I think we've got a passage in this section 25 that I just want to highlight, and I guess I wonder what people think of here. So he thinks that in the history of people, when scholars step into the foreground, these are ages of exhaustion. These are often ages of evening, yeah, of decline. Yeah, that scholars look back to the past and to the energy of the past because life in the present has sort of stopped, has lost its energy. And I think partly he's got this worry that I think we also saw in Mill, that we've got this worry that we've reached the sort of culmination of Western culture. That Western culture with this great living energetic culture that has somehow got to the end of its creative time. This is something that Niçe is worried about. I think Nietzsche's idea is it needs new myths. And Niçe thinks that a predominance of mandarins always means something is wrong. So once you have bureaucrats, if you have a very uniform, this is the Mandarin here, this is a Chinese idea. Remember Emile, when he's talking about uniformity, that his example of a society that has lost its vitality is China. So China is a society that he thinks has become stagnant because it no longer endorses individuality. This is Emile's understanding of, and I think we've got the same sort of worry here, that a predominance of mandarins always means something is wrong. But so too to the advent of democracy, the international courts in place of war. Yeah, so this shows a lack of vitality when we favor peace and international law, equal rights for women, the religion of pity, and whatever symptoms of declining life there are. So I think, for example, if you're a feminist, you might think to what degree it's kind of Nietzsche's philosophy. It's very, I talked about, is Nietzsche an incel? Yeah, but there's a lot of sort of macho posturing in Nietzsche. So is there a way, what can one take from Nietzsche if one buys into certain feminist ideals? Is it too much of this sort of macho chest thumping and look at me? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, we've got 15 minutes, so I'm just wondering what I should do, because I wanted to talk about 113, and I wanted to give that, I think I want to start doing that next time. So, yeah, so any sort of questions or thoughts so far about Nietzsche? If not, I could choose a few random things to talk about, because I think the discussion in 113, this is the end of a 2-hour class, and 113, okay, so no one has any comments, thoughts? Is Nietzsche just a sexist? Is it kind of, yeah, There's something wrong with modern society because of the advent of democracy, the advent of, the United Nations, peaceful world order, equal rights for women. It's got rid of sort of masculine virility. We've got this religion of pity. And Nietzsche thinks that pity goes together with contempt. So if you pity someone, pitying someone always goes together with looking down on them. Yeah, and being pitied, being pitied is not nice. Being the object of charity is not nice. Yeah, and these are all symptoms of decline. And I think, Nietzsche wants to kind of take many values and see the world from many perspectives. I think his kind of opposition to democracy in democratic culture and his kind of opposition to equal rights for women and to feminism are quite kind of, personally, I think these are kind of real sort of commitments for Nietzsche. So I think that, I always think when you're reading Nietzsche, there's bits of Nietzsche I really like, but at the same time, he is someone who is anti-democratic, who's anti-feminist, who in some sense is against sort of international law, and it seems to be against international courts. These are all signs of decadence. Okay, no questions? I'm wondering. I've got 15 minutes. Okay, so one thing we can look at is what he has to say about aesthetics. So how far have people read in Nietzsche? Have you read, how far have you got through with the text? Oops, Ejeb, you're the only one there with the camera on, so it's like, yeah, you better hide yourself.
No, I have an unstable internet connection.
Okay. I was just joking. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit then about Nietzsche's aesthetics. I was hoping some of you might have some questions or some comments, but as you didn't, and I wanted to finish off with section 113, but I think that's a really good section. And I guess maybe I don't want to do it right at the end of a 2-hour class when people are sort of losing concentration and there aren't many people here anyway. So I'll next class, tomorrow in class, I'll talk about section 113. So I'd like you all to read that. One of the things about the third essay is that the third essay is sort of about aesthetics. He starts off the third essay by talking about aesthetic ideals and by talking about art. And in particular, he's talking about Wagner. And one of the things going on in the background is Wagner was this kind of monster full of energy, but his sort of final sort of works have this kind of more Christian side of them. He becomes more sort of conservative. You know, in his early days, Wagner was on the barricades in 1848 against in the Republican Revolution. By the time of Parsifal, he's come to, in some sense, his paganism has sort of become Christianized. And so he's a sort of artist who's wearing the mantle of self-renunciation. So the first few sections of the third essay are going to be difficult to understand if you don't know anything about Wagner. Yeah. But basically the idea is he's making lots of sort of digs at Wagner for kind of taking this turn towards renunciation and valuing a sort of life of renunciation. And then in number 6, now, so he has this discussion of Wagner. But in the third essay, section number 6, he sort of has a discussion of Kant. Now, has anyone have you ever done a class on Kantian aesthetics? Has anyone read Kant's third critique? Has anyone offered a class? I'm just wondering, none of you have ever done a class on aesthetics? Or so Kant wrote 3 critiques. He wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, which is about theoretical knowledge. He wrote the Critique of Practical Reason, which is about ethics. And then he wrote the third critique, which is the Critique of Judgment, which is about aesthetics and biology. Yeah, it's about living systems and life, and it's about aesthetics. And within aesthetics, he thinks there are 2 main sort of aesthetic qualities, which are the experience of beauty and the experience of the sublime. Yeah, so he offers in the first half of the Critique of Judgment, Kant offers a very kind of very influential and very important accounts of beauty and the sublime. And Kant thinks that both in the case of beauty and the sublime, we have a certain type of pleasure. Yeah, so the sublime, he thinks there are 2 types of sublime. There's a mathematical sublime when something is sort of so huge, it's overwhelming. So when you look at the pyramids from the right distance, it's sort of, you can't take it in one go, but you know it's a single unified thing made up of parts. Yeah. And you've got things like storms for the dynamic sublime. So after Kant, you had the kind of romantic painters who'd have lone figures standing with a kind of storm outside, and you're a bit afraid of the storm, but you're watching it from safe, and this makes you aware of your own freedom. So Kant gave this analysis of these 2 aesthetic responses, and his account of beauty is quite complex. So he offers a whole bunch of accounts of a bunch of things about the nature of beauty. But one of the central things about his account of beauty is he thinks that the experience of beauty involves a sort of disinterested pleasure. Yeah. So the notion of the sort of pleasure we get in aesthetic enjoyment is a disinterested pleasure. Yeah, it's a pleasure without interest. And I take it that you know, like, I don't know, if you're a sort of lots of people in Turkey, you see a beautiful view and you think, oh my God, that's great. I could turn it into a car park, or, you know, I could build a, you know, you look at a bit of Istanbul and you think, I could cover it in concrete. Yeah. So if you're a sort of property developer, you look at a bit of land and you think, I could put concrete there and make money, and that gives you some pleasure. So he thinks that Kant thinks that the sort of pleasure we get in aesthetics has to be disinterested. That I take it that you know, like, that we don't see the thing as a sort of means to something else. Yeah, we experience the thing as, yeah, we don't have any desire to do anything. Yeah. Now, when he says disinterested, like, he thinks there is a sort of, we do want to linger over the pleasure. So we kind of do want this pleasure we get in beauty to continue. But this is the yeah. So this section, section 6, Schopenhauer as well. So Schopenhauer was a very sexual guy, and so one of the things Niçe says about Schopenhauer is that he wrote his main work when he was in his early 20s, and he was this guy full of sexual energy, and wherever he looks, yeah, there's just kind of you know, he's always getting sexually excited, yeah, and he just can't control it, and so he's just sort of driven by unsatisfied sexual desire. This is kind of Nietzsche's analysis of Schopenhauer, and this is his experience of the will. So Schopenhauer wrote that the thing in itself is will, and we come to know will from the first person perspective through sexual desire. Yeah, when he's gone hard, that's the kind of subjective experience of will. Yeah, and will is something bad. Yeah, and Schopenhauer is like, the only time you can escape from will is by listening to music. And of course, these were days before you had CDs. So the only way to listen to music, you had to go to the theater, you had to go and, you know, you had to go out, and it was a big deal. So for Schopenhauer, listening to music was a way of overcoming that. He had these moments of peace when he's not being driven by his animal desires, yeah, by his in particular sexual. I mean, Nietzsche thinks that really for Schopenhauer, and this is something, if you read through these passages, it's very clear that Schopenhauer is this young man, and his desires and his drives are these sort of sexual desire. So he says that here we come back to Schopenhauer, who stood much closer to the arts than Kant, and yet did not free himself from the spell of the Kantian definition that pleasure, beauty, the experience of beauty involved disinterested happen. How did that happen? The circumstance is remarkable enough. He interpreted the term without interest in an extremely personal way, on the basis of one of his most regular experiences. Of the few things that Schopenhauer speaks with greater assurance than he does of the effect of aesthetic contemplation. He says that it counteracts sexual interestedness, you know, like lupin or camphor or a cold shower. You know, music is great because it's a bit like a cold shower, you know. Yeah, he never wearied of glorifying this liberation from the will as the great merit and utility of the aesthetic condition. So for Schopenhauer, the great thing about music is it sort of overcomes sexual desire for a short time, or it overcomes this striving. And then you might think, well, instead of going to the opera, couldn't you just have a cold shower? is music, does music have the same value as a cold shower? Yeah. In all questions concerning Schopenhauer's philosophy, by the way, one should never forget that it was the conception of a young man of 26, and so that it partakes not only of the specific qualities of Schopenhauer, but also of the specific qualities of that period of life. Yeah, so you know, especially living in a conservative society, that being a 26-year-old without that much money means living in a state of sort of sexual frustration. This is sort of this is Nietzsche's analysis of Schopenhauer's philosophy. It's the everyone's philosophy is the expression of who they are. Yeah, it's not that each philosophy is the expression of the age in life, in thought, as Hegel thought, because there is no spirit of the age for Nietzsche. But each sort of philosopher expresses themselves in their philosophy. And Schopenhauer's philosophy is the philosophy of a sexually frustrated 26-year-old. This is Nietzsche's analysis. So one thing about Kant and Nietzsche, Kant and Schopenhauer, is they've got a similar view on aesthetics. And he says that Kant, like all philosophers, instead of envisioning the aesthetic problem from the point of view of the artist, considered art and the beautiful purely from that of the spectator. So I think Nietzsche's aesthetic, that really he wants to understand art from the perspective of the artist, art as a form of expression. If you're interested in the philosophy of art and aesthetics, I think one person who also goes in this way is Dewey, the pragmatist, very popular in Republican Turkey. But he's got a book called Art, I think written in the 1910s or 20s, called Art as Expression. And unconsciously introduced the spectator into the concept of the beautiful. That is beautiful. Yeah, so, but I fear that the reverse has always been the case, as in Kant's famous definition, the beautiful, lack of any refined first-hand experience, reposes in the shape of a fat worm of error. That is beautiful, says Kant, which gives us pleasure without interest. Without interest, compare this with the definition one framed by a genuine spectator and artist, Stendhal. So Nietzsche's two favorite novelists, writers, were Stendhal. He's got The Red and the Black, great novel if you've never read it. If you haven't read it, put it on your list of great novels to read. And also he was reading Dostoevsky. He just discovered Dostoevsky at this time, but he didn't read the big novels. I think he'd only read Notes from the Underground and a couple of other. He hadn't read Karamazov, for example, or The Idiot. He read, I think the first Dostoevsky he read was Notes from the Underground. So if you want a bit of literature together with Nietzsche, I think the Red and the Black by Stendhal and Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground are both influential. So Stendhal once called the beautiful a promise of happiness, un promise de bonheur. Yeah, and this is, of course, I think, sexual beauty. It's a kind of, the experience of beauty is the kind of promise of sex. Yeah, yeah. So yeah. At any rate, he rejected and repudiated the one point about the aesthetic condition which Kant had stressed. Le désintéressement. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Who is right, Kant or Stendhal? And remember his talks about knowledge, and there's no such thing as disinterested knowledge. There's no such thing as, yeah. So I think he's skeptical about the idea of having a sort of standpoint without the will. In some sense, this sort of standpoint of disinterestedness is itself interested. So, you know, that Schopenhauer has this pure contemplation, but he's interested in overcoming his own kind of sexual desires. So the sort of disinterested standpoint of pure contemplation is itself a very specifically interested sort of perspective. So next class, why don't next class I'll finish off talking about disinterestedness, and his discussion of aesthetics. And then I'll talk about section 113. Each class, I keep promising you that next class we'll talk about 113. We never get to it. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.